Zionism, the movement to establish and develop a Jewish state. But in practice, is it a story of national liberation or one of colonization and oppression? This quiet community is the relic of an ideology that shaped Israel and Palestine for almost a century. It's called a kibbutz, the home of left-wing socialist Zionism.
From all over the world, they came, small bands of young men and women disillusioned with the injustices they'd known. They came determined to create a new society.
A commune whose residents were all equal. Nobody privately owned anything. Even the kids were raised by the entire community. The socialist Zionism that created the kibbutz was once the dominant political force in Israel. But it's a far cry from the extreme Israeli government of today.
Benjamin Netanyahu is thought to be close to announcing he has officially formed the country's most far-right ever government.
Security forces have been clashing with protesters opposing the government's newly passed law to restrict the power of the judiciary.
If you take away this sole check on the government, then you essentially have a dictatorship.
There's been fury in Israel after the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza.
Both the kibbutz and the government are Zionist, so how can they be so different? Well, Zionism is not actually one single ideology. It has many faces. The one common strand uniting them all is the belief that the Jews should have a national home, an independent state of their own. But how to go about achieving this, where and when, how militant or diplomatic this movement should be, and whether it's compatible with a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish one will vary wildly depending on which kind of Zionism you're talking about. The Zionist movement is almost always painted in black and white. It's either a racist settler colonial project dispossessing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, or it's a people escaping persecution and genocide, finally achieving national liberation. The reality is that Zionism has been both of these things, and everything in between. And to understand it properly, we have to go back almost 150 years, to when Israel was still just an idea. The year is 1895. We're outside a military school in Paris. The highest-ranking Jewish captain in the French army stands at attention. He's just been found guilty of supplying the Germans with weapons schematics. Espionage. His name is Alfred Dreyfus, and the buttons and medals are ripped from his tunic. He's marched around the square and humiliated, while onlookers chant for his execution and the death of the Jews. This seemingly small moment in history will set in motion events that still shape the world today. You see, the French have the wrong man. Dreyfus is innocent, but the trial has been marred by anti-Semitism. Evidence proving his innocence is ignored, and more is fabricated to frame him. He'll be sentenced to prison in French Guiana. The scandal will become known as the Dreyfus Affair. And in that crowd of onlookers outside the military school, a young Jewish Austro-Hungarian journalist is watching. He's been covering the trial for a Viennese newspaper. The trial has confirmed all of his worst fears about the future of Jews in Europe, and he makes up his mind. The Jews need a country of their own. The young journalist is Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism. The region he settles on for the new Jewish homeland, with deep significance in the Jewish faith and traditions, is then Ottoman Palestine. But the idea doesn't catch on as quickly as Herzl had hoped. To some, he's delusional. The plan is so unrealistic it's almost laughable. Many anti-Zionist Jewish religious leaders denounce the idea, viewing it as jumping the gun on Jewish prophecies. It's also strongly opposed by a secular socialist organisation, the Jewish Labour Bund. The Bundists want to combat anti-Semitism by remaining in their home countries and gaining autonomy, attempting to promote Yiddish, a language spoken by European Jews. With their Marxist socialist ideology, they express solidarity with colonized people around the world, and suspect the Zionist movement will put Jews on a collision course with the Arabs who currently live in Palestine, as well as taking away support for their own movement. But the idea of Jews moving to Palestine isn't totally new. It actually has a name, Aliyah, which means to ascend in Hebrew. There are Jews that have been living in then Ottoman Palestine in small numbers for centuries, and those who've arrived in the first wave of Aliyah. Most are fleeing the pogroms, anti-Semitic riots in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe, often with the encouragement of the government and police, that will eventually kill between 100,000 and 200,000 Jews. The majority of their fellow refugees will head to the USA, but a small portion choose Ottoman Palestine. Cultural Zionism now gains a foothold. This form of Zionism isn't exactly against creating a political state, but its priority is to develop a cultural and spiritual centre for Jews in Palestine. Instead of promoting Yiddish, Zionists bring the Hebrew language, largely extinct as a spoken language for 2,000 years, back from the dead. But the concept of Zionism is still fringe, and Herzl wants to make it mainstream. He gets to work, travelling around Europe and the Middle East, rubbing shoulders with some heavy hitters, and drumming up support for his Zionist movement. He even tries to bribe the Ottoman Sultan. Herzl's original ideology, applying political pressure and intense lobbying for his cause, will come to be known as political Zionism. It takes a few years, but Zionism begins to spread. In 1897, Herzl convenes the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland, the predecessor to today's World Zionist Organization. Jews purchase land in Palestine, and the Jewish National Fund is established to facilitate land purchases. It's worth noting, though, that the sellers of this land to the Jews are landlords, who often don't live on the land they're selling themselves. The people actually living in these areas usually don't get a say in the sales. That will eventually mean that even though these purchases are conducted legally, it will still lead to the dispossession of many of the 350,000 Palestinian Arabs who live in the region at the time. This will create bitter resentment towards the Jews who bought the land. Bizarrely, some European anti-Semites and early Zionists temporarily have complementary goals: the large-scale migration of Jews, though Zionism focused on self-determination and escaping persecution, while anti-Semites just wanted the Jews out of Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe has a long history. Over centuries, Jewish populations have gone through cycles of peaceful integration within European societies. But at various times, they've been barred from owning land and holding public office. Guilds exclude them from most jobs, leaving just a few they can work in. Money lending, trade, and commerce. This is where anti-Semitic tropes of money-grabbing Jews are born. And as a scattered people around Europe, often living in small numbers, they're a useful and easy scapegoat. Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague, economic decline, and political assassinations they had nothing to do with. After they failed to convert Jews to Christianity, Christian anti-Semites portray them as worshippers of Satan. They're massacred and expelled from countries over and over again. Things are particularly bad in the Russian Empire, where violent pogroms are rife. Jews are only allowed permanent residence in one poor western region, called the Pale of Settlement, and a forged anti-Semitic document is making the rounds: the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Made to look like it's come from a secret Jewish group plotting world domination, in reality, it's been produced by the Russian secret police in order to increase support for the Russian Empire's virulently anti-Semitic policies. Despite being proven as a forgery multiple times, this fake document has shaped anti-Semitic discourse until today. The centuries of this vicious anti-Semitism are adding urgency to the Zionist movement. But Herzl won't live to see it grow. He dies in 1904 from a heart condition. But Zionism now has momentum. The second Aliyah brings a wave of Jewish migrants and refugees from Russia in the lead-up to the Russian Revolution, escaping yet more pogroms in Eastern Europe. By 1920, over 2 million Jews have left Eastern Europe due to anti-Semitic persecution. And they bring with them the revolutionary socialist spirit that is spread throughout the Russian Empire, infusing socialism with Zionism. Socialist or Labour Zionism grows fast, advocating for diplomacy and migration to Palestine to establish a Jewish state, with an agricultural society and secular socialist politics. This brand of the ideology particularly appeals to oppressed European Jews, and quickly becomes the dominant form of the ideology. Now, this is all happening in a Europe of colonial empires, so you cannot separate the Zionist movement from the colonial attitudes that are widespread at the time. Many early Zionist leaders, including Herzl before his death, will express as much, claiming they want to, quote, bring European civilization to the Middle East. While some are pushing for peaceful coexistence with the Arabs, others are talking of population transfers. Part of a strategy to ensure a Jewish demographic majority in the future state. Sometimes unspoken, creating that Jewish majority will be a core goal of many early Zionist leaders. When the Labour Zionists arrive in Palestine, they set up a community that will become a model for other socialist Zionists settling in the region. This is the very first kibbutz, Degania Aleph. But while the kibbutzim will be egalitarian for their residents, for the most part, they refuse to hire non-Jewish workers or allow non-Jews to become residents, in an effort to create a self-sufficient Jewish economy. The economic exclusion of the Arabs confirms earlier Bundist concerns for the local population, and leads to more resentment towards the Jews arriving in Palestine. A small Zionist paramilitary, Bar Giora, is formed, and would later become Hashomer, tasked with guarding Jewish settlements. Zionism continues developing more flavours. On the political right, revisionist Zionism emerges in opposition to Labour Zionism, with maximalist territorial ambitions. It pushed for an Israeli state over all of what is today Israel, Palestine and Jordan. Although the claim over Jordan is more of a symbolic one, and most of their focus will remain west of the Jordan River. Religious Zionism starts growing as well. At the time, most Orthodox Jews are actually anti-Zionists. They believe that the Jews can only return to the land they were expelled from 2,000 years ago by the Romans through divine intervention and the coming of the Messiah. So they view the creation of a Jewish state as a blasphemous act. But some are starting to get on board with Zionism, arguing that Jews moving to what they believe is the Promised Land is a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. It is three forms of Zionism: socialist, revisionist, and religious Zionism that will shape the movement the most through the early and mid-1900s. But there are other forms too. General Zionists are in the political centre and aren't aligned with the other Zionist groups. Less popular and more short-lived is territorialist Zionism. Territorialist Zionists are happy with territory full stop and are willing to find alternatives to Palestine to settle in, arguing the soul is greater than the soil. Uganda is even briefly floated as a potential Jewish homeland. There is another unlikely ally for this movement too: Christian Zionists, who believe that the return of the Jews to Israel is a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ. Until today, it's particularly widespread among evangelical Christians. There are, in fact, far more Christian Zionists than there are Jews as a whole, let alone Jewish Zionists. Most are in the United States, in part explaining America's close relationship with Israel. As the competing forms of Zionism battle it out, a global conflict is about to turbocharge the Zionist movement. June 1914. Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary. 2 shots ring out on a corner of Franz Joseph Street. In the back of a car, one strikes Sophie, the Duchess of Hohenberg, in the abdomen. The other hits Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The 2 are dead within 30 minutes. The gun's been fired by a Bosnian Serb assassin, and as Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia in response, a complex network of alliances drags over 30 countries into the fighting. The Great War, or World War I, has begun.
From a pistol shot at Sarajevo, the first of the great modern world wars exploded. And almost overnight, all of Europe was engulfed in conflict.
The nations formed 2 warring blocs. The Allied powers, including Great Britain, against the Central Powers, among them the Ottoman Empire, which controls Palestine. The British are looking to consolidate support from different ethnic groups in their sprawling empire. Zionists seize the moment and achieve an enormous political victory. After intense lobbying from Zionists and their political allies, the British issue the Balfour Declaration, proclaiming support for a Jewish state in Palestine. In many ways, it's actually a revival of a proclamation made by Napoleon over 150 years earlier. It also states that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And we'll see how all that turns out. Britain sees a lot of benefits for itself in this arrangement too. As well as shoring up support among Jewish Zionist communities in the fight against the Central Powers, with a Jewish state, they wouldn't have to take in as many European Jews fleeing the pogroms. And they get a new ally with, quote, European values in the Middle East. One that'll help them maintain control over the Suez Canal next door in Egypt. This creates what seems like a contradiction. A historically oppressed people are about to be implicated in a British colonial project. But the Balfour Declaration flies in the face of a conflicting agreement Britain has made with the Arabs. They're under the impression that the McMahon-Hussein correspondence has promised this land to them, in exchange for staging an uprising against the Ottomans. That is a problem, a big one, but one the British will hope to resolve later. For now, they need everyone on side. And with the help of the Arab Revolt and the Jewish Legion in the British Army, the Central Powers are defeated. But now there's some confusion. It's becoming clear that not only have the British made 2 conflicting promises to the Arabs and Jews, but they've also negotiated in secret with the French and Russians to carve up former Ottoman territory among themselves. This is the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Rather than becoming independent, most of the Middle East was placed under British and French administrations.
So, Ottoman Palestine becomes Mandatory Palestine and is administered by the British, along with Transjordan on the other side of the Jordan River. With the Balfour Declaration, more Jews head to Palestine. The 3rd and 4th Aliyah brings a new influx of Jews from Europe, escaping pogroms in Russia, Poland, and Hungary. Jewish soldiers who'd fought in the war form a new and much stronger Zionist paramilitary. This is the birth of the Haganah, and over the next decades, the cracks in Zionism will widen. Unrest in Palestine is spreading. The local Arab population is growing more resistant to the arrival of Jewish migrants and refugees. Palestinian riots and revolts periodically spring up in Mandatory Palestine. During these, several massacres of Jewish communities add fuel to the Zionist movement and convince more Jews to take up arms. The Haganah grows in strength, and prior to World War II, it tries to operate with a policy of havlagah, self-restraint, opposing retaliatory attacks on Arabs. But not everyone is on board with that restraint. The Irgun, a revisionist Zionist paramilitary, splits off from the Haganah and advocates for the use of force to establish a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan River. The Irgun emblem reflects their goals, an arm holding a rifle with an outline of mandatory Palestine and Transjordan in the background. The founder of Revisionist Zionism is also the leader of Irgun, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and he's sympathetic to fascism. Prior to the Italian alliance with Nazi Germany, the group even explores the possibility of an alliance with fascist Italy. The Irgun will undertake a terror campaign against the British and Palestinians. They bomb Palestinian markets in Haifa and Jaffa, and justify these attacks as retaliation for Jews killed in the Arab revolts and deterrence for future Arab attacks on Jews. Now it's the lead up to World War II. The Nazis have risen to power in Germany, and Jews flee Nazi persecution. 250,000 of them make it to mandatory Palestine, the fifth Aliyah. The rise of the Nazis forces some Jews to make the impossible choice of negotiating with them to save some of their people from annihilation. 60,000 escaped the Nazis as a result of the Haavara Agreement between Zionist organizations and Nazi Germany. This agreement is controversial and causes more fractures in the Zionist movement. The man who negotiated this agreement is assassinated by 2 revisionist Zionists. This agreement will end after the start of World War II, and the Nazis' genocidal plan for the Jews, the final solution, becomes clear. With the arrival of more Jews in mandatory Palestine, the unrest in the local Arab population boils over and becomes a full-scale revolt against the British. The British crack down hard, crushing the revolt. 5,000 Palestinians are killed, over 12,000 detained. It's during this unrest that there's growing talk of partition. The British Peel Report recommends creating one Jewish state and one Palestinian state. But partition risks more unrest. With a looming threat of war in Europe, the British need to put a stop to the revolt now. They issue the White Paper of 1939, limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine and the sale of Palestinian land to Jews. The Zionist paramilitaries are furious. But with the Nazis as their common enemy, the British managed to keep the Haganah and Irgun on side. A more extreme faction within Irgun is incensed and refuses to cooperate. Lehi, or the Stern Gang, is born. Its leader, Avraham Stern, has authoritarian and fascist tendencies, though after his death, the group will move closer to communism. They are the most unrestrained of the 3 paramilitaries, and will continue to carry out attacks as World War II begins. Assassinations, bombings, bank robberies, kidnappings, and executions of British soldiers and Palestinian civilians, militants, and informants. Before they realised the extent of the Nazis' genocidal plan for the Jews, Lehi actually proposes an alliance with Nazi Germany, viewing Britain as a greater threat to their revisionist Zionist goals. As the end of World War II draws near, it's obvious Nazi Germany will lose. And the world is coming to terms with the scale of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews exterminated, a third of the entire global Jewish population and 2/3 of European Jews gone in the Nazis' attempt to eradicate the Jewish people from existence, along with millions of others murdered by the Nazis as well. The Jewish anti-Zionist Bundists had remained in their home countries in Europe, attempting to gain autonomy. By now, most have been murdered by the Nazis. The ideology is essentially wiped out, leaving just a few surviving pockets. The Yiddish language is driven to extinction in its native territory, though it survives in those who moved abroad. Entire European Orthodox Jewish anti-Zionist communities have met a similar fate. there are now 250,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors in camps around Europe. They've lost everything. Many fear returning to where they once lived, where, in a lot of cases, their fellow countrymen sent them to their deaths and took their homes. They need somewhere to go. In the traumatized Jewish population, anti-Zionist beliefs dip sharply. Gradually, the majority of Jews will start to support the creation of a Jewish state. For most of them, this genocide and the pursuit of a safe haven for Jews will be deeply ingrained in their Jewish identity. The restrictions on Jewish entry to Palestine, though, remain. The Irgun has had enough and returns to militant activity alongside Lehi.
Violence continues to rule in Palestine. Scores of Jewish leaders are jailed and rigid searches are conducted for terrorist weapons.
Initially, the Haganah opposes them, even capturing and handing over Irgun and Stern Gang members to the British. But after the end of World War II, the Haganah joins the Irgun and Lehi. All the main Zionist militias are now under the unified command of the United Resistance Movement. By 1945, the British have established a naval blockade to stop ships carrying refugees and migrants to mandatory Palestine.
For many Jews, including refugees from Hitler's Germany, Palestine was the only hope.
The Americans, on the other hand, are sympathetic to the Jews and publicly support the relocation of 100,000 Jewish refugees to Palestine, putting them at odds with their allies, the British. Meanwhile, the Haganah has a plan to break through the naval blockade and get some of the Holocaust survivors to mandatory Palestine. With the help of a fundraising effort from American Jews, they acquire a dilapidated old passenger ship, the SS Exodus. They forge passports to allow 4,500 Holocaust survivors to embark as passengers and set sail. As they approach mandatory Palestine, they're intercepted by the British.
Boatloads were brought ashore and put into detention camps before being sent back to Europe.
2 refugees and 1 crew member are killed in the ensuing struggle. Dozens are injured.
The British were criticised for what many felt to be inhumane treatment of desperate refugees.
They're all transferred back to France and then to Allied-occupied Germany. The international outcry is swift and generates more support for the Zionist movement. In response, the Zionist paramilitaries escalate their attacks. The Irgun is responsible for the deadliest attack during this period, the bombing of the British administrative headquarters for mandatory Palestine in Jerusalem's King David Hotel.
The tragic scene is like a serious incident during the Blitz. 65 deaths are reported, and there is little or no hope of survival for any of the 58 missing.
The British, in all the chaos of their conflicting promises, and exhausted after World War II, hand over the Palestinian mandate to the United Nations and plan to remove troops from Palestine. The UN proposes partitioning Palestine into 1 Arab and 1 Jewish state.
The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized.
It places many Palestinian villages in the proposed Jewish state and creates enclaves for Arab cities like Jaffa. Labour Zionists accept this partition.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state.
Revisionist Zionists do too, but they are more sceptical since they want more territory. And it's outright rejected by the Palestinians. Palestinian Arabs begin to riot.
Isolated police were more or less powerless to deal with the riot, which beginning as a demonstration quickly led to the burning of Jewish shops and the general destruction of Jewish property.
The situation soon escalates into civil war.
Latest pictures from war-torn Palestine provide these impressions of Haganah forces consolidating areas under their control.
Irgun and the Stern Gang are particularly brutal. The Stern Gang executes 5 members of a Palestinian Bedouin clan in retaliation for an Arab informant giving information to the British. They hang 2 British sergeants from trees, booby-trapping their bodies so that those that come to recover them are injured. Despite the escalating violence, the British begin withdrawing troops, leaving the Jews and Arabs to fight it out amongst themselves. The policy of Havlagar is now truly a thing of the past, and the new strategy is one of offensive and reprisal. Over 400 Palestinian villages are destroyed or depopulated, along with several larger towns. The attacks on Jewish and Palestinian civilians in the previous periods of unrest have created decades of bitterness between Arab and Jewish populations. And now, armed groups have their chance at revenge. Several massacres of Palestinian civilians are attributed to the Zionist paramilitaries. One of the most infamous is committed by the Irgun at Deir Yassin. Some massacres are also carried out by Palestinian and other Arab forces. On the eve of the complete British withdrawal, the Zionists declare Israel's independence. The following day, all of Israel's Arab neighbours attack at once. The civil war becomes the first Arab-Israeli war. During the fighting, the Haganah and Irgun are incorporated into the newly formed Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, as are many individual members of Lehi. The IDF is led by Labour Zionist and former Haganah leader David Ben-Gurion. This merger doesn't go entirely smoothly. In fact, it almost causes civil war when a firefight erupts between the newly formed IDF and Irgun volunteers arriving by ship from Europe, leaving 16 Irgun and 3 IDF fighters dead. But the leaders of both forces manage to calm the tensions before it escalates further. This battle does, though, leave bitterness between the Labour and Revisionist Zionists. In a way, it's a precursor to the divides between Israel's left and right wing today. With all the Zionists kind of united, and with the backing of some Arab Druze and northern Bedouin populations, Israel will win the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, securing more strategic positions than was given to them under the UN Partition Plan. Jordan will annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Egypt will occupy the Gaza Strip, and Israel has ensured its survival. Israel's victory in this war kicks off a huge, forced movement of people that will last decades. 700,000 Palestinians are either expelled from or choose to leave what is now Israel. Palestinians call this Al-Nakba, the catastrophe, and it will see around half of Palestinians lose their homes, never to return again. There's another movement of people too. You see, at the time, there are some 950,000 Middle Eastern Jews living throughout the Arab world and Muslim-majority countries. Anti-Semitism in these countries now intensifies rapidly. Middle Eastern Jewish populations as a whole are all suspected of supporting the new Jewish state, whether they actually do or not. The Arab League has drafted a law planning to freeze the assets of all Jewish citizens, and in turn all Jews suspected of being active Zionists. And individual Arab states take steps mirroring this draft law. Many are arrested, their property confiscated, and they're stripped of citizenship. Some are even executed. Over 900,000 Jews will either choose to leave or be driven out of the Arab world and Iran. This map shows the change in Jewish populations throughout the Middle East and North Africa following the war. Today, it's thought that only around 15,000 Jews remain living in the Arab world and Iran. To give just a few examples, in Iraq, once home to 97,000 Jews, fewer than 100 are left. In Egypt, once home to 81,000, just 180 remain. And in Algeria, where 160,000 Jews once lived, there are now just 200. 650,000 of those Middle Eastern and North African Jews head to the newly created Israel. While the Zionist militias have largely been incorporated into the new Israeli military, militia members will leave behind political legacies too. The revisionist leader of Irgun, Menachem Begin, will form the Herut, or Freedom Party. Decades later, this will be incorporated with other parties into Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu's governing party today. The leader of the Haganah and then the IDF, Ben-Gurion, has formed the Labour Zionist Mapai. This will later be incorporated into the Israel Labour Party. Ben-Gurion becomes Israel's first prime minister. He's one of the people who's privately supported the population transfer of Arabs out of Israel. Mapai and Labour Zionism will be the dominant forces in Israeli politics for the next 6 elections. And with the dominance of Labour Zionism comes the spread of the communities that form the bedrock of the movement. The Kibbutzim are part of the founding story of Israel, and there will eventually be 270 of them dotted around the country, that are today still home to over 120,000 people, out of Israel's 9.3 million. The word itself means gathering in Hebrew, and the people that live on them are known as kibbutzniks. It becomes a rite of passage for many Jews and Zionist non-Jews to come and volunteer on kibbutzim, and these socialist communities grow and grow, becoming a big part of the country's economy and food supply. 2 years after Israel is established, the Knesset, Israeli parliament, passes the law of return. This gives every Jew the right to come to Israel as an immigrant. The same right is not extended to Palestinians who lost their homes in the Nakba. That will provide a safe haven for Jews forced out of Arab countries and Iran, but at the same time, it also helps solidify the Jewish demographic majority in the young Israel. The kibbutzim afford immigrants and refugees the opportunity to settle easily within a community, learn Hebrew, and train in manual work for a few months. Many will then be offered the option of remaining on the kibbutz and officially becoming kibbutz members, who get to vote on communal decisions. Labour Zionist kibbutzniks also secure a lot of power in government. Despite only making up 4% of Israel's population, by 1962, 4 out of 14 government ministers will be kibbutz members. So the socialist Zionist kibbutzim gain an outsized influence over Israeli society. And they get pretty favourable treatment from the government as a result, including subsidies.
I came to the kibbutz when the dream of a socialist place, a socialist community, was very, very strong, and that was the main idea. We don't earn money, a salary. Each family receives a budget. That's the meaning the manager of industry or the gardener or agricultural worker earns the same money. And of course, the level of life for all the members was more or less the same, because everybody receives according to the number of members in the family. There were no private cars, for example. There were common cars that everybody used to ask when he wants to go out from the kibbutz. The education was free, totally free for all the children, and all of them receive exactly the same, or more or less the same. The clothes you wear was more or less the same, because you receive a budget and you buy it in the same places.
All the members live in equality. It means that nobody had his own money or something like that, and everything was corporate, like dining room, we ate together.
An air-conditioned dining room is the center of kibbutz life.
We lived in a big house, and in the house we slept and we eat and we learn and we get a shower.
Each night the parents visit the children's houses to put their own children to bed.
We saw our parents only 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day, and our parents were very idealist, and they built the kibbutz and they built the country. They had a mission.
The mid-1900s are the heydays for the kibbutzim and socialist Zionism. And for a while, the growth rate of these socialist communities will outpace the rest of the country. For the first time arises a generation born and raised in the kibbutzim, as residents have children, so the communities keep growing. And the overall quality of life inside them is pretty high compared to the general population. It won't be long though before Israel is once again at war with its neighbours. I've covered Israel's various wars in more detail in my Golan Heights video. But the 1967 Six-Day War is a decisive victory for Israel. In under a week, it captures the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Another 350,000 Palestinians are either expelled from or choose to leave their homes, in what Palestinians call al-Naqsa, the setback. The same goes for 130,000 Syrians in the Golan Heights. And a new political movement is stirring, the movement for Greater Israel. It pushes for Israel to hold onto all of the territory it's captured. To facilitate this movement, some of its supporters move into the newly occupied territories and build Israeli settlements, considered illegal under international law, to entrench Israeli control of the regions. From the outside, these might look a bit like the kibbutzim, but their politics are far to the right. Many involved in this movement are revisionist and religious Zionists, but another, far more extreme form of Zionism is developing too. Neo-Zionism. This is the most extreme form of the ideology to date. It is theocratic and far-right in nature, weaving both biblical prophecy and ultra-nationalism into its political platform, and sees no separation of church and state. The combination is a potent one. It is particularly extreme towards Palestinians and other Arabs. Neo-Zionists have argued for deporting Palestinians from all Israeli-held territory. And one particularly infamous form of Neo-Zionism can be traced halfway across the world, to the second largest Jewish population on Earth.
Your leader arrives tonight, just Louis Britt. It is 60 degrees in New York City in Midtown. Jenny C. Riley, number 3 in New York on WWI.
The 1960s in the United States is a decade of turmoil. Peace protests are erupting around the country in opposition to the Vietnam War.
One of the largest peace demonstrations in history was held last October in Washington. More than 50,000 persons took part.
And at the same time, race relations are at a boiling point. While Jim Crow laws enforce racial segregation, the civil rights movement is in full swing.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
But it faces fierce resistance and entrenched racism in both white American society and institutions.
I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Civil rights activists are the targets of violence.
The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death by an assassin late today as he stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee.
Jews are very active in the civil rights movement, and for a while, many civil rights leaders view the Jewish community as one of their closest allies in the push for equal rights.
As Jews, it is not merely sympathy and compassion for the black people of America that motivates us. It is a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience.
This makes Jews the target of violence too. Synagogues are attacked, and 2 Jews and a black activist are murdered in Mississippi in 1964, while registering African American voters. The killers were members of the white supremacist terrorist hate group, the Ku Klux Klan. That story is eventually turned into a movie. But it is, of all things, a New York teachers' strike that strains this alliance, pitting a mostly Jewish teachers' union against a mostly black and Puerto Rican local community in Brooklyn. It's a complicated story, but in short, That local community wants more control over their education system, after years of poor funding and overcrowding that's led to students attending school in shifts.
We're beginning to see a struggle coming to a head. And in New York City, I think throughout the nation, the focus of the struggle will be control of schools.
The union is for reform and more funding, but not giving total control of education to the local community. In response, the local school board will fire 13 of the teachers. All but one of them is Jewish.
By virtue of what authority? By virtue of what authority?
Things get ugly fast. An anti-Semitic poem written by one of the students is read out by a teacher on the radio.
Before this all happened, there were clearly black-white issues. But as this developed, it became more and more anti-Semitic.
On the other side of the divide, those opposing the school board are also accused of racism.
The teachers' walkout was translated as a white front against the blacks.
We are here again tonight in disgust at racist people sitting on this board.
The situation escalates so much that the police have to get involved, preventing the fired teachers returning to the schools. In response, the union goes on strike. It's all over the news. Nearly 1 million students miss weeks of school. This strike is often cited as the moment the Black-Jewish alliance of the civil rights movement began to break down.
Reverend Oliver, what about the business of anti-Semitism we were told? What kind of scars do you think this is going to leave?
The teachers must realize that the communities must be heard. It's unfortunate that scars must come, but we have had 300 years of scars, and it's about time those scars were healing.
Tensions between the two groups grow, and an American Jew from Brooklyn senses his moment. At the time, Rabbi Meir Kahane is writing articles for an Orthodox Jewish magazine, and he pounces on rising fears of anti-Semitism, pumping out stories of Jews being attacked by Black and Puerto Rican Americans. He founds the Jewish Defense League, or JDL.
With the polarization of left and right, we think it's time for Jews to bear arms.
Their stated goal is to protect Jews from anti-Semitism by any means necessary. Now, Kahane is staunchly right-wing, and he's worked with the CIA and FBI before, infiltrating left-wing groups and drumming up support for the Vietnam War among Orthodox Jewish communities. In its early years, the JDL operates as a kind of vigilante group and sends armed patrols of right-wing Jews into Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods. The JDL also violently targets Arab institutions, as well as Soviet ones, in retaliation for anti-Semitic practices and policies in the Soviet Union and in opposition to communism. Eventually, it attracts 18,000 members. It adopts the rallying cry, "Never Again," in reference to the Holocaust. Kahane himself is drawing support from a few sources. A white backlash against the civil rights movement, fears of rising anti-Semitism, a rift forming between Jewish and Black communities, and anti-communists for his targeting of the Soviet Union. Over time, his group gets more and more militant and extreme.
You keep on condoning acts of violence and say you're going to continue to do so. Where is this all going to stop?
Those who commit violence against Jews within their borders can fully expect, and rightly so, violence in return.
Ultimately, decades later, the JDL will be classified as a right-wing terrorist organization.
We have people who have been trained and who are out now who intend to make sure that Arafat and his lieutenants do not leave this country alive.
But you are saying that you plan to kill them.
We are planning to assassinate Mr. Arafat.
With all this, Kahane is under increasing scrutiny from the authorities. He's arrested for making a firebomb and serves a year in prison. After his release, he moves to Israel in 1971. He's arrived in an Israel still riding high after victory in the Six-Day War, as Israeli settlers, proponents of Greater Israel, are moving into the newly occupied territories of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula. Here, he establishes a new political party. Kach is born. The party's specific strain of neo-Zionist ideology is named after its founder, Kahanism, and it is extreme.
The question of the Arabs is something which no party is willing to deal with, this greatest of all problems. The Arabs are not equal citizens here.
My answer, to transfer the Arabs out of this country.
By force?
Hopefully through compensation and their willingness to leave.
If compensation doesn't work and they're not willing?
Through force.
He advocates for expelling Arabs from Israel, criminalizing sexual relations between Arabs and Jews, and a Jewish theocracy in place of a democratic state.
I don't want a state of Jews. I want a Jewish state.
Kahanism is where fascism and Zionism coalesce.
What I said was that there was a contradiction between Western democracy and a Jewish state.
Kach isn't the first far-right or fascist Zionist group. There were fascist elements within Irgun, and the same goes for Lehi. And there are other small splinter groups too. But post-1948, Kach will be the most impactful. For now, though, Kach, Kahanism, and other similar forms of Neo-Zionism are fringe. But Kahaná has established Kach just in time for the 1973 Yom Kippur War. A surprise attack from Egypt and Syria pushes Israel to the brink of defeat. Israel turns the tide and survives, but at a very high cost. This Pyrrhic victory leaves its mark on Israeli politics. The fear of a loss against the surrounding Arab nations in a future war fuels the growth of all right-wing Zionist ideologies, including Neo-Zionism. This also pushes Israel's religious Zionists further right. Religious Zionists view Israel's victory in these wars as a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. And more religious Zionist settlers move into the occupied territories. It also damages the Labour Zionist brand. The high casualty numbers in '73 happened under the leadership of Labour Zionist Golda Meir, and are seen as her administration's failure. As a result, she will resign. Labour Zionist Yitzhak Rabin will take Golda Meir's place and win the next election with an alliance of left-wing parties and a religious one. Rabin is the first Sabra to serve as Israeli Prime Minister. Sabra is a term for Jews born in Israel or Palestine. Kach doesn't win any seats. In 1975, the United Nations is about to issue a resolution after a debate spearheaded by the Soviet Union, and its message is clear. Zionism is racism. It's controversial. It passes on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, when the Nazis launched a series of pogroms against Jews in Germany. Again, there are multiple truths here, because some ideologies within Zionism certainly are racist, colonial, and aggressively expansionist. But the resolution has been tainted by deep-rooted anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union and further afield. A lot of it echoes that anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion I mentioned earlier. It's also the height of the Cold War, so the debate is highly politicized as a proxy front between the Soviet Union and USA. But at the same time, a wave of decolonization has been spreading across the world.
Since 1945, 20 nations have gained their independence.
Many formerly colonized states view Israel as a tool of racist Western imperialism.
My country broke off diplomatic relations with Israel in support for the cause of all Arab brothers.
The resolution passes by a wide margin.
Israel.
No.
No. Italy.
No.
No. Ivory Coast.
No.
No. Jamaica. Abstention.
Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Yes.
Yes.
But it's strongly opposed by many Western states.
The United States of America declares that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. Thank you, Mr. President.
Now remember, a big part of the socialist Zionist ideology was to use diplomacy to achieve Zionist goals. Revisionists, on the other hand, focused on military and national strength. So, a diplomatically isolated Israel strengthens the revisionists' hand, and the country begins drifting towards more hardline and right-wing revisionist policies. Support within Israel for Israeli settlement of the occupied territories actually increases. The resolution will be repealed 16 years later, again by a wide margin.
UNGA Resolution 3379, the so-called Zionism is Racism resolution, mocks the principles upon which the United Nations was founded.
But the shift rightwards in Israel is a hint of things to come. Because in the 70s, demographics are also about to change Israeli politics, until now dominated by socialist Zionism, forever. And there are a few dynamics in Israeli society at play that will make this happen. First, Israeli politics is being shaped along religious lines. Almost half of Israeli Jews identify as Hiloni, non-traditional and secular Jews. 29% as Masorti, combining traditions with modern values. 13% as Dati, more traditional and conservative, but integrated well in Israeli society. And 9% as Haredi, ultra-Orthodox and less integrated. Typically in Israel, the more religious end of the spectrum tends to vote with right-wing Zionist parties. There are very small groups of anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox Jews, but these are a tiny minority. On the less religious side, it's a bit more mixed, but more secular voters tend to align with centre and left-wing Zionist groups. And the religious right wing tends to have far more children than the liberal left. So through sheer population growth alone, with increasing numbers of young right-wing voters, right-wing forms of Zionism look set to grow fast. But another, often overlooked factor is the political rift between Jews from different ethnic backgrounds in Israel. Ashkenazi Jews, those whose heritage lies in Central and Eastern Europe, were the first to arrive and establish Israel as a state, and make up 32% of the population. For the most part, they wanted a secular socialist Israel. But after Israel's independence came the arrival of the hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern and North African Jews who'd either left or been forced out of their home countries. And they're more religious, not socialists, and have their own unique cultures and customs. The Ashkenazi Israeli establishment lumped them all together and gave them one name, obscuring their distinct differences. Mizrahim, Easterners, even though this term was also used to refer to Sephardic Jews, whose ancestors were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 1400s, Maghrebi Jews who came from North Africa, and other minority Jewish groups. So Mizrahi is essentially a catch-all term for non-Ashkenazi Jews. This is the largest Jewish group in Israel, around 45% of the population. A further 20% of the country is Arab, but for the purposes of this video about Zionism, I won't be going into detail on Arab voting patterns in Israel. Many Arabs feel disenfranchised by the state, and only one Arab party has ever briefly been included in a government coalition in 2021. It's an ethnic mosaic on top of a religious one, and is one of the reasons Israel has such a vast number of small political parties in government. And here is one of the most important patterns in Israeli politics. Mizrahi Jews tend to be more conservative, aligning more with right-wing forms of Zionism, while Ashkenazi Jews tend to be more left-wing, voting for centre and Labour Zionist parties. And you can see this in Israel's cities. Tel Aviv is an Ashkenazi Labour Zionist stronghold, where left-wing parties tend to do well in elections. The same is of course true for the numerous kibbutzim around the country. Beersheva is a Mizrahi revisionist Zionist stronghold, where right-wing parties do well. West Jerusalem is home to a lot of religious Zionist voters, while Nazareth is Israel's Arab capital, where Arab parties do well. So where does this huge divide between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews come from? Well, with more Mizrahi Jews arriving in Israel, let's see how that egalitarian Jewish society is coming along.
A tower block in downtown Tel Aviv, and in its shadow, a slum. Two sorts of housing for two sorts of Jew.
Some call the earlier established Ashkenazi Jews the first Israel, and the new arrivals the second Israel. Their names reflect their levels of privilege in Israeli society.
The theory is that the land and the wealth of Israel belongs to all Jews, no matter where they come from. The reality is different, and it's becoming increasingly evident that Israel's society is a divided one.
The Mizrahi Jews spoke different languages, came from different ethnic backgrounds and cultures, and had different histories, and struggled to navigate the state bureaucracy set up by Ashkenazi Jews.
Today, the Orientals comprise 60% of the population, but compared with the Ashkenazi Jews who came from North America, Europe and Russia, they're definitely the have-nots of Israeli society.
In their home countries, they'd all be categorized as Jews. Now they were labeled as Moroccans, Iraqis, Iranians, and so on, and faced stigmas, prejudices, and discrimination as ethnic minorities.
I do not want to be a Sephardi, I do not want to be an Ashkenazi. My problem is to be a Jew and an Israeli.
On the whole, they were given lower paid jobs and made up the bulk of the working class, while the Ashkenazi Jews had cushy positions higher up the social ladder.
These people resent being excluded from this affluence and point ironically to the egalitarian ideals on which the State of Israel was founded.
The disdain for Mizrahi cultures is obvious. Mizrahi Jews are sent to poor towns, called development towns, lacking in infrastructure, while European Ashkenazi Jews get the best housing. Radio stations even refuse to play Mizrahi music. The discrimination and wealth gap becomes such an issue that it's causing civil unrest. Resentment between the groups grows. It even leads to the formation of a group called the Israeli Black Panthers, inspired by the civil rights movement in the USA, created by left-wing Mizrahi Jews. So the Mizrahi community is marginalized, but a lot of them have also faced persecution in the countries they've left behind. So they tend to have unsympathetic views towards the Palestinians and surrounding Arab countries. It's against this backdrop that we reach the 1977 general elections. And Israel's right wing is on track for its first major win. A conservative politician is making waves. He's one of the founders of Likud, a Holocaust survivor and former Irgun commander. You've met him before. Menachem Begin is a right-wing populist. He's a polite character, but one who can give fiery speeches. He speaks directly into the cameras at debates and holds rallies around the country while complacency has gripped the Israeli left. He's Ashkenazi himself, but his anti-establishment rhetoric strikes a chord with working-class Mizrahi Jews, who also support his hawkish stance on Palestinians and the surrounding Arab countries. Begin shocks the country, defeating the Labour Zionists, and the near-constant shift rightwards in Israeli politics begins. For the first time, religious Zionist parties ally with the right-wing revisionist Zionists, and Israel has a right-wing prime minister. This is a political earthquake, and becomes known as the Mahapach, the upheaval. The newly elected Likud advocates for Greater Israel and further settlement of the occupied territories Israel captured in 1967. Its party platform states that, quote, between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty, and that, quote, settlement is the focal point of the Zionist effort to redeem the country. While it does say this should be done while, quote, taking care not to dispossess anyone, in practice, it undermines any possibility for a contiguous Palestinian state. For the movement for Greater Israel, this is a big win. But in office, Begin gives up some of the territory the settlers have been moving into. He makes peace with Egypt's Anwar Sadat, returning control of the Sinai Peninsula in return for, among other things, Egypt's recognition of Israel as a state, a peace agreement for which both leaders will receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Kahanism feels Likud has betrayed the country by giving up the Sinai Peninsula. He's furious. His followers are too, and he's expanding his appeal. Like Begin, Kahanism tries appealing to marginalized Jewish groups, tapping into Mizrahi grievances. It'll take years, but this will eventually pay off. In the meantime, After the Yom Kippur War, Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, make a big move.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
The embargo only lasts a year, but after the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, oil production takes another big hit. So global energy prices skyrocket.
Gas lines at many stations were a lot longer than normal.
Why doesn't anybody contact the president? Why is he letting this happen to us?
In Israel, for example, petrol prices have risen far above OPEC levels. The latest increase last month was 40%.
Israel is also dealing with higher security costs with all the newly occupied territories.
Israelis have been living with inflation for years. It's impossible to avoid in a country that spends over a third of its budget on defense.
It now faces an inflation crisis that will change the country forever. And more on that shortly. For now, the tension between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews remains high, and the divide between the first and second Israel is growing. At a Labour Zionist rally in Tel Aviv, a comedian takes the stage. A warm-up act for the main event. "It's a pleasure to see all these good people," he remarks. He then uses a racial slur. "It's good to see there are no tachim here to violently break up this rally." The word is a derogatory one, used to refer to young Mizrahi males. Begin responds at his own rally.
Ashkenazi, Iraqi, Yehudim, Achim, Lohamim.
The vote of Mizrahi Jews allows Begin to narrowly win the next election, by 1 seat. His is the first administration to appoint Mizrahi Jews to government positions. By 1981, Israel will have its first Mizrahi deputy prime minister. And though to this day Israel has never had a Mizrahi prime minister, Mizrahi Jews now had a political home in Likud, and have been a reliable right-wing voting bloc ever since. Kahane's Kach party still doesn't have enough votes to win any seats, but he does win more votes than last time. But Kahanists and Kach members do not limit their activity to politics. Some are willing to use violence too. They are responsible for indiscriminate attacks against Palestinian civilians and are linked to stabbings and grenade attacks. Other small extremist Zionist groups emerge during this time too. The Jewish Underground conducts car bombings and an indiscriminate shooting attack on Palestinian students in Hebron. In a few cases, some members of the Israeli military had ties to these underground groups. So by the 1980s, the country is lurching right. Labour Zionism no longer enjoys the total dominance it once had, and Israel's first right-wing prime minister, Menachem Begin, is in charge. But he won't stick around for much longer. Under his leadership, Israel goes to war in Lebanon. It doesn't go to plan. There's high Israeli casualties, and Israeli proxy forces in Lebanon massacre 3,500 Palestinians in refugee camps.
For 3 grim days last September, Lebanese Christians slaughtered Palestinian civilians in Beirut's Sabra and Shatila refugee camps.
Begin is also dealing with poor health, and his wife has passed away, sending him into a deep depression. He resigns. Yitzhak Shamir takes his place, a former Lehi commander. And while he will engage in peace talks with the Palestinians, he also encourages more Israeli settlement of the Palestinian territories occupied since the Six-Day War. Shamir increases funding for settlements. By the 1984 elections, the Knesset is caught in a tug-of-war between the declining left-wing and growing right-wing Zionist parties. Labour Zionists win the most seats, but again, the win is narrow, so the Socialists and Revisionists form a national unity government. But something has changed. In this election, Kahane's neo-Zionist message has broken through, enough that he manages to win a single seat for himself in the Knesset. Kahaneh brings intense xenophobia and racism into the Israeli Knesset.
And I want to make it clear to those dogs that are standing there, there is no such thing as an Arab village in the state of Israel.
His views are so extreme that his speeches are often boycotted by the rest of parliament.
The problem is not education. This is the blood of all the people.
But his extremist views will slowly become more normalized in Israeli political discussion. The economic situation in the country isn't rosy either. And by November 1984, a percentage is striking fear into the hearts of Israel's economists and politicians. 445%. It's the rate of inflation, and it doesn't take an economist to know that that is catastrophically high. Israel turns to its closest ally, the US, for help. The dream of a socialist Israel is dead. In its place, American-backed neoliberal reforms. The 1985 Economic Stabilization Plan. Israel now faces austerity as public expenditure is slashed. Factories will shut down, workers lose their jobs, wages fall in real terms by 12 to 14%. All very painful for the country and a recipe for more political radicalization. But inflation falls all the way down to 20%. This is the birth of the Israeli capitalism of today. And with it comes a big reduction in the role of the labor Zionist communities, the Kibbutzim, in the country. They find themselves deeply in debt and owe the equivalent of $4 billion. That, effectively, means bankruptcy. Billions of shekels have to be paid by the Israeli government and forgiven by the banks to bail these communities out. To help their economies recover, their businesses are privatized, and they slash their budgets. Now remember, kibbutzniks at the time have no private income. That community budget is all they have. So around this time, kibbutzniks start to consider working a little bit extra for more money for their families. An idea that goes against the very foundations of the kibbutz movement. At the same time, the kibbutzim and labor Zionists as a whole are the focus of a lot of public criticism for this economic disaster.
Until then, the kibbutz gave us everything we need. We start to live like everyone, to have salary. The houses become it belongs to us now. Many changes. And during this period, many people from the kibbutz left the kibbutz because they didn't want the changes.
It's not like the dream we have before 30, 40, 50 or 60 years. There are more and more issues that it's privatization. People work in different places, they earn different amount of money, and the level of life depends more and more of the earning of the family and not the budget of the kibbutz.
Labor Zionism and the kibbutzim are now caught in a pincer movement between economic and social changes within the kibbutzim and labor Zionist ideology as a whole, and an ongoing rightward lurch in Israeli politics. The region isn't just going through economic chaos either. 2 years after the Economic Stabilization Plan, the First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, erupts and will last almost 6 years.
Today, the Israelis say they shot dead 2 more demonstrators, bringing the number of deaths to 16.
It's during this unrest that the Palestinian militant group, Hamas, is born. As the Intifada rages on, Israel holds the 1988 general elections. The result is once again close, forcing the Labour and Revisionist Zionists to form another national unity government. But in this election, the radicalization of elements of Israeli society is much more obvious.
Hello from the Holy Land! It would be a lot holier with the Arabs out.
You see, this time, with both the unrest from the Intifada and painful economic conditions, Meir Kahane has gained a lot of ground. Enough that some political forecasters predict that Kach could win up to 12 seats in parliament, making it the third largest party in the Knesset. This is too much for most Israelis, including those on the right. Fearing Kach's extremism, the government has passed an amendment to Israel's elections law. It bars anyone from running for a seat in the Knesset for any of the following reasons. 1. The rejection of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state. 2. Incitement of racism. 3. Support for the armed struggle of enemy states or terrorist organizations against the State of Israel. And 4. A reasonable basis to conclude that the party will be used for illegal activities. Kahane and Kach members are banned from running. The support for Kahanist ideas, though, is still there. The Second Intifada is dragging on, and after campaigning on making peace and ending the violence through talks with the Palestinians, left-wing Labour Zionists will win the 1992 elections.
Labour looks certain to have an effective majority in the new Knesset with allies on the left.
Yitzhak Rabin, the first native-born Prime Minister, is back in office. This will be the Labour Zionists' last ever big win. And as for Meir Kahane,
a gunman in New York City last night assassinated Meir Kahane, the fiery rabbi who founded the Jewish Defense League and advocated driving all Arabs from Israel.
Kahane may be dead, but his ideology will continue to attract supporters. There's been another huge change in Israeli society too.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time, and an era comes to an end.
By 1991, the world witnesses the collapse of a giant. One nation becomes 15 new countries, and almost 1 million Jews will arrive in Israel from former Soviet states. Once again, Jews from Eastern Europe will reshape the region's culture and politics. In the blink of an eye, Israel's population increases by 20%. Suddenly, Russian is the third most spoken language in the country.
Добрый вечер. Добрый вечер, Михаил. Похоже, партия Кадима окончательно разваливается, и вопрос в том, она доживет до выборов или все...
When they reach Israel, the new arrivals have yet to figure out their political allegiances. A lot initially vote for Labour, but over time, with negative experiences under communism, they will become a solid right-wing voting bloc, eventually giving a big boost to Likud and other right-wing parties. There is now a growing secular but anti-socialist vote. Still, for now, Labour's Yitzhak Rabin is in charge and moves forward with the peace process. The Oslo Accords, a series of peace agreements between Israel and Palestine, are signed.
Once the agreement will be implemented, no longer will the Palestinians reside under our domination.
There's hope that this might pave the way for a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli one as soon as 1999, and peace between the two sides at last. That being said, the agreements don't actually mention a Palestinian state, and Rabin supports creating a Palestinian governing quote-unquote entity which is less than a state, not a fully independent Palestine. Left and right-wing in Israel are becoming synonymous with where you stand on Israel and Palestine. Left-wing Zionists are associated with a peace process that gives the Palestinians their own state. Right-wing Zionists oppose that plan. Given that many religious Zionists have moved into the occupied Palestinian territories, there is a natural alliance between religious and revisionist Zionist parties. Some Palestinian militant groups, like Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also oppose the peace process. Before it's revised in 2016, the Hamas Charter outlines the group's goals, including the destruction of Israel as a state.
Attacks on Israelis are increasing, the government's trying to make peace with a very fragile majority.
For many on the Israeli right, this peace process is a national betrayal and is giving up the basic elements of Zionism to terrorist organizations. Menachem Begin's old party, Likud, strongly opposes the deal. Later that same year, a doctor and IDF reservist will enter a West Bank mosque with a semi-automatic rifle.
In the West Bank town of Hebron, a U.S.-born Israeli settler named Baruch Goldstein opens fire in a crowded mosque.
29 Palestinians are killed, over 120 injured. The horrific attack is widely condemned in Israel, but Kach celebrates it.
Today, after the attack, Israeli militants hailed him as a hero.
What was also familiar was his political outlook. He was very critical of the peace process. His hero and good friend was the late Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Kach itself is then recognized as a terrorist organization, but it continues to operate as an underground movement. The fragile peace agreements are strained by this attack.
Massacre threatens to claim another casualty. Peace talks between Israel and the PLO.
And in steps a man ready to capitalize on these circumstances. He is a former Special Forces soldier, and he lambasts the Israeli left for what he sees as delusional dreams of peace. A revisionist Zionist, his fans call him Bibi. Benjamin Netanyahu is about to shape Israeli politics for more than 2 decades. He's recently been elected chair of the Likud party. Netanyahu is educated in the States, adopting American-style personality-centered politics. He speaks perfect English, something widely admired in Israel. Say what you will about Netanyahu, but he is a savvy political operator. He seems to have an innate ability to read the Israeli public, and taps into anger at the peace process. He shares the stage with Kahanist speakers at incendiary rallies, where Rabin is accused of treason and pictured in a Nazi uniform. In the crowd watching Netanyahu speak is another future Israeli political figure, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the son of Kurdish Mizrahi Jews from Iraq. His mother was involved with Irgun, and he has been radicalized during the First Intifada and joined Kach before it was outlawed. For a while, he was their youth coordinator. At the time, he has a portrait of the Hebron massacre terrorist Baruch Goldstein hanging in his living room. He has such extreme views that he's been prohibited from military service in Israel. On one occasion, after Rabin's car is swarmed by angry protesters, Ben-Gvir, while holding the hood ornament ripped from Rabin's car, will proclaim, "We got to his car, and we'll get to him too." The following year, Rabin is assassinated.
The assassination today of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, gunned down at a pro-government rally tonight in Tel Aviv. A young Israeli student linked to a right-wing Israeli extremist group was arrested at the scene.
The shooter has links to Kach and is motivated by his strong opposition to the Oslo Accords and giving up any land to the Palestinians. Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir will be accused of inciting Rabin's assassination through their inflammatory rhetoric. The killing receives support from many right-wing organizations, so much so that the Knesset will eventually pass a law to prevent an Israeli president from pardoning any assassin of a prime minister. Following the death of Rabin, the government calls early elections. With support for the peace process still strong and outrage over the assassination, it looks like Labour Zionists are on track for a major victory, with wide leads in the polls. But Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad also see this vulnerable moment for the peace process, and in it, an opportunity to derail the agreements even further. They carry out more bombings and murders. Hamas is responsible for the Jaffa Road bus bombings, in which 28 Israelis are killed. Israelis as a whole grow more suspicious of the peace process, and the Labour Zionists who are pushing for it begin to fall in the polls. But Labour ekes out a win, with 2 more seats than Likud. But here's the thing, the election rules have changed. For a limited time, instead of parties nominating leaders in the Knesset, the Prime Minister is decided by a direct vote, a bit like an American presidential election. And while Labour has won the most seats in the Knesset, Benjamin Netanyahu wins the direct vote for Prime Minister. He becomes Israeli PM for the first time. At 47, he's the youngest person to ever hold the position. And while he will still meet with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat for peace talks, he seems to be doing all he can to undermine the Oslo Accords. He presides over an increase in Israeli settlement of the Palestinian territories, and denounces the agreements as incompatible with Israel's right to security and what he views as the historic right of the Jewish people to all of Israel and Palestine. To the west, he frames Israel as the last line of defense between Europe and the Middle East, a beacon of Western-style democracy in what he portrays as a backwards and uncivilized region, and uses that to justify Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. He's also building ties with ultra-Orthodox communities, increasing religious Zionist support for right-wing Zionist parties, something he'll later rely on. But almost as quickly as Netanyahu is in, he's out again. Poor economic conditions and a floundering peace process leads the public to sour on Likud, while his own base views him as too moderate. He loses the 1999 election decisively.
At 49, Netanyahu became overnight Israel's youngest ex-prime minister. His party was not just defeated, but crushed.
To top it off, Netanyahu resigns as Likud leader and is replaced by Ariel Sharon, nicknamed the Bulldozer for his look and political style. Sharon was defense minister under Begin. Many see him as responsible for the atrocities committed during the war in Lebanon in the 80s.
לא הייתה לנו ולו לרגע מחשבה שהם יעשו את מה שהם עשו.
But the sidelined Netanyahu isn't done yet. He plans his political comeback, and to make that happen, he shifts further right, reconsolidating support from his base. Around this time, as the debate over the peace process rages on, post-Zionism develops too. It's a relatively new concept, so its true definition is debated. Right-wing Zionists have even used it as a kind of insult. But one broad definition is the belief that the Zionist goal was fulfilled when Israel was established as a state, and that the movement should be considered over. It also acknowledges historical wrongs like the dispossession, killing, and oppression of Palestinians over the course of the Zionist movement. Fast forward to 2000. There's growing frustration at the stalling peace process. Despite ongoing peace talks, Israeli settler activity is continuing. This is angering the Palestinians because it violates the spirit of the Oslo Accords. Tension between Israelis and Palestinians remains high, and Ariel Sharon makes a provocative statement on Israeli control of the holiest site in Jerusalem.
The sovereignty over the Temple Mount, it's in our hands now. It will be in our hands in the future.
It's the spark that ignites the powder keg. The second Palestinian Intifada explodes. Israeli forces crack down hard, prompting the uprising to escalate into armed rebellion. To many Israelis, this is seen as vindication of Likud and Netanyahu's warnings about the futility of the Oslo Accords. It is the final nail in the coffin for the Labour Zionists and the peace process. Likud's Ariel Sharon wins a special election decisively. He becomes Prime Minister, and Likud wins the following general election too. But Sharon has changed. Once a war hawk and a big supporter of the settler movement, now he tries to revive peace talks with the Palestinians. To do this, and avoid opposition from within his own party, he breaks from Likud and forms the centrist Kadima party, with moderates and other supporters of peace talks. He expels hardliners from the government and invites Labour to form a coalition. This will leave Netanyahu an opening to retake his position as leader of Likud. Sharon's new party and coalition enables him to initiate the withdrawal of the Israeli military and settlers from the Gaza Strip, bringing an end to the Second Intifada, after the deaths of over 6,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis. Under Sharon, Israel begins constructing the West Bank barrier between the Palestinian territories and Israel, which the International Court of Justice and the United Nations state violates international law. A lot of it is built on Palestinian land. With this barrier, further segregation of Israeli and Palestinian communities takes place. In this kind of environment, extreme views about those on the other side of the wall develop more easily, and sympathy across the political and national aisle decreases. Sharon also plans a withdrawal from parts of the West Bank too. But everything is about to go wrong for Kadima. Sharon, now well-liked within Israel, suffers a stroke. He'll be in a coma for the next 8 years. The withdrawal plan is stopped in its tracks. On top of that, Hamas will take power in the Gaza Strip, and Israel gets involved in another war in Lebanon. By 2009, right-wing parties are able to win the most seats in the Knesset. And Netanyahu is back at the head of a coalition.
At Judaism's holiest site, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a prayer of thanks for his political comeback.
And he is here to stay. He'll be in power for the next 12 years. Israeli politics will become ever more centered around his personality. Left and right wing are morphing into anti- and pro-Netanyahu, respectively. Israeli settler activity continues increasing, and peace looks a long way off. Now out in the political wilderness, the Labour Zionist left is fractured, made up of many smaller parties, and Likud maintains its grip on power. Around the same time, Israeli capitalism seems to be thriving, moving the country further and further from its socialist beginnings. There's a lot of investment in its tech industry, and Israel develops a reputation as the startup nation. Meanwhile, the Kahanist Ben Gvir has been making a name for himself. By now, he's been convicted of at least 8 crimes, including incitement of racism and possession of propaganda for a terrorist organization. But he's thrived off the outrage he's caused and risen through the political ranks. He'll eventually become the head of the political party Jewish Power. This is the ideological successor to the outlawed Kach party. Under the same amendment that banned Kach from the Knesset, Ben Gvir really shouldn't be in this position. But legal and institutional norms have been eroded, and here he is. He'll come back shortly. For now, Netanyahu continues shifting to the right to maintain the support of an increasingly extreme base. After almost a decade in office, Netanyahu faces 3 separate corruption investigations from the Attorney General. He's accused of accepting $1 million shekels in bribery and quid pro quo agreements with news outlets in return for favourable coverage. He's also stacking his cabinet and government institutions with loyalists and awarding himself powerful positions. At one point, he's serving as Prime Minister, Defence Minister, Health Minister, and Foreign Minister. This is alienating some of his coalition partners. His government has also passed a very controversial law that sent the Knesset and much of the Israeli public into uproar. The nation-state law.
Israeli lawmakers have passed a law declaring the country the, quote, nation state of the Jewish people.
Moments after Israel's parliament passed the controversial new law, Ahmed Tibi and other Arab members of the Knesset ripped up copies of it.
It declares Jewish settlement a, quote, national value, removes Arabic as an official language, and only gives the right of national self-determination to Jews in Israel. Its critics argue it enshrines Jewish supremacy in law. The government that loves to sell itself as the only democracy in the Middle East is getting a lot less democratic. There's other debates too, namely over military conscription for ultra-Orthodox Jews, who've been exempt from military service, a long-standing point of friction in Israeli politics. With all this, the political atmosphere is incredibly polarized. Some members of the government withdraw from the coalition. Netanyahu calls early elections. And Israel is about to be engulfed in political chaos. Between 2019 and 2021, 4 snap elections will produce inconclusive results, including Israel's first and second ever ties. As this is going on, Netanyahu is accused of escalating violence in Gaza and in Arab riots that have spread around the country to prevent a coalition government forming to oust him. But by the 4th round of elections, opposition parties are able to agree on a coalition.
Benjamin Netanyahu's battle to stay in power finally ended in defeat over the weekend after 4 extremely close elections in 2 years.
For a brief moment, Netanyahu is out of office.
The 71-year-old former prime minister had one last speech before handing power over to Bennett.
We'll be back soon.
That's not his only problem. He's also been indicted for the 3 corruption cases, and he's now on trial.
Witnesses in Benjamin Netanyahu's trial start testifying today, but he won't be sitting through the hearing.
It looks like his political career may finally be on its last legs. But he is still Likud leader, and the trial doesn't seem to harm him in the polls. Quite the opposite, he's campaigned on a promise to make himself immune from prosecution.
מה שעומד היום למשפט זה הניסיון לסכל את רצון העם.
The government coalition that ousted Netanyahu is diverse and short-lived. It will collapse. Israel faces its 5th election in 4 years, and things are about to come full circle. Netanyahu pulls off another feat of political survival.
Benjamin Netanyahu is thought to be close to announcing he has officially formed the country's most far-right ever government.
His Likud party has managed to win the most seats in the Knesset, and this is where Ben Gvir comes back in. After alienating more moderate parties, Netanyahu has to turn to ever more extreme politicians to form a coalition government and remain in power. Jewish Power has won 6 seats. That's 6 politicians that Netanyahu needs on side. Ben Gvir, the man who had a portrait of a terrorist mass murderer in his living room, so extreme that he couldn't even serve in the Israeli military, is now kingmaker in the Israeli parliament. And in return for entering a coalition with Likud, Netanyahu appoints him National Security Minister, in charge of Israel's police force. He's now one of the most powerful people in the country. Years after Meir Kahana's death, Kahanism now has a powerful seat at the table. In this extreme coalition, there's also the far-right religious Zionist party. Its leader, Bezalel Smotrich, is in the cabinet too, who calls himself a fascist homophobe, has advocated for a shoot-to-kill policy to deal with Palestinians throwing stones, and suggested that starving 2 million Gazans may be quote-unquote just and moral, to pressure Hamas to return Israeli hostages. For his part in the coalition, he's awarded the position of finance minister. Now, not only have fascist Zionist politics made their way into the Knesset, but they've also creeped into powerful cabinet positions. They are well and truly normalized in Israeli politics. To give you an idea of how far Labour Zionism has fallen since Israel's founding, Israel's Labour Party, once the dominant party in Israeli politics, won just 4 seats in the Knesset, 2 less than Jewish Power and 3 less than the religious Zionist party. Israel's democratic backsliding will now accelerate. In a preview of things to come, Netanyahu and his loyalists push for a judicial overhaul, claiming they want to reduce the power of unelected judges. In reality, the move centralizes more power in the government and limits judicial oversight. It's a move towards autocracy that will prevent the Supreme Court striking down parliamentary decisions and allow the government far more sway in picking judges. With the way political institutions are structured in Israel, the president has no veto power over legislation, and there's only one government chamber, the Knesset. The only check on government power is the judiciary.
If you take away this sole check on the government, then you essentially have a dictatorship.
In response to the plan, protests spread across Israel. some of the largest in the country's history. The government will pause the plan, but it's not over.
After days of massive protests, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will announce a halt to the judicial overhaul.
The 2023 Hamas attack kills almost 1,200 people in Israel. A further 240 are kidnapped and brought back to the Gaza Strip. It's the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust, and it further radicalizes segments of the Israeli population.
Hamas will understand. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them for decades to come.
In response, Israel will launch an invasion of Gaza that at the time of recording has killed over 50,000 Palestinians. Israel blocks aid entering Gaza. More than 2 million people are displaced, and Palestinians in the Strip are facing the threat of famine. The UN rules that the population of Gaza is at imminent risk of genocide.
Breaking news, the International Criminal Court moments ago announced it is seeking arrest warrants for the leaders of Hamas and also seeking arrest warrants for the political and military leadership of the State of Israel.
When a temporary ceasefire is negotiated between Israel and Hamas, Gvir resigns from the cabinet. He's been pushing for Israel to encourage, quote, voluntary emigration of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, so that Israel can seize control of the territory. It's just another way of saying ethnic cleansing. At the time, he states he will rejoin the coalition if fighting resumes. And that is exactly what happens.
Benjamin Netanyahu has reappointed Itamar Ben-Gvir as the National Security Minister.
By March 2025, he's back. His return comes just as 2 of Netanyahu's aides are arrested in another corruption case. For Netanyahu, the timing is perfect. The man who has maneuvered his way through scandal after scandal has a strong coalition with Jewish power on board. If he so chooses, he can continue the war in Gaza, push ahead with full annexation of the occupied West Bank, or, say, fire the Attorney General and Intelligence Chief, who are both now investigating him. He can also push ahead with those judicial reforms that will give him even more power, motivated by his own political survival and avoiding potential prison. This is Zionism's complicated reality. It has many faces, and none of them are problem-free. While early left-wing forms of Zionism are often romanticized, they were still influenced by European colonial attitudes, and ultimately economically excluded and dispossessed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. At the same time, the movement was also fueled by desperate people fleeing genocide in Europe, searching for a safe haven, and Jews driven out of Middle Eastern and North African countries. The state Zionism has built, though, has become progressively more and more extreme. That's clearly reflected in the Israeli revisionist, religious, and neo-Zionist government, which is doubling down on all the very worst elements within Zionism, upholding and intensifying what NGOs describe as an apartheid system of racial segregation in the West Bank. And the country also appears to be pushing forward with the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. But what of the old socialist communities, whose politics once dominated Israel? Today, they are shadows of what they once were.
Lots of the projects that were once thriving on the kibbutz, like farming and stuff, aren't necessarily here anymore, so a lot of the buildings that were used for them have been abandoned.
Despite the collapse of the kibbutzim, spend a bit of time on one today and there are still some echoes of their collective nature. They are still far to the left of the country as a whole.
There is a second-hand store here at the kibbutz where everything is free, so people bring their stuff. I guess they donate it, and then anyone can come and take anything they want.
One of the hallmarks of the kibbutzim in their heyday was the communal dining room, where everybody ate together. After the economic collapse of the kibbutzim, a lot of those communal dining halls shut down because of a lack of money to keep them running. But Kibbutz Shamir is one of a few wealthier kibbutzim that still has that dining hall. And before I'd cycled to the Golan Heights, I'd been invited by Eyal for lunch there.
This is the main dishes.
Cool.
Salads.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eyal. Welcome.
As we ate, I wondered how the original Labour Zionist kibbutz founders would have felt to see this left-wing island as the country around it slides ever rightwards, and the democratic backsliding as a far-right government gives itself more and more power. Would they be all that surprised, given how the country was founded? Or is this just the logical next step of the movement they started? Regardless, the kibbutzim today remain only as monuments to an ideology that once reigned supreme here.